Hi everyone, Patrick here. Just quickly introducing our guest for today's episode. So, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Tim Falconer to talk about his new book, Windfall, Viola MacMillan and Her Notorious Mining Scandal, which, as the title implies, is about a mining scandal and one of its central figures, Viola MacMillan. It's a really fascinating book, and I encourage people to check it out. As usual, there's a link in the description. So, Tim Falconer is himself a well known author here in Canada who lives in Toronto. And his last two books are rather indicative of the scope of subjects that he tends to broach in his publications. So he recently wrote Bad Singer, the surprising science fiction of tone deafness and how we hear music, as well as Klondikers, Dawson City's Stanley Cup Challenge, and How a Nation Fell in Love with Hockey, both of which, by the way, made the Globe and Mail's top 100 list. So, without further ado, let's get right into the interview.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Okay, so I'm here talking with Tim Falconer about his new book, Windfall. So, first of all, Tim, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So, can you start with the most general question here, which is explaining to the audience who might not be aware of what Windfall is, what exactly this book is about, and a little bit of background on it?
So Windfall is the story of a 1964 mining stock scandal um, that had that was, front page news and then had reverberations, which I'm sure we'll get into. One of the most interesting things about this scandal is that the person at the center of it was a woman who was extremely prominent in the mining industry in Canada. So that added a kind of a nice angle to the book. And so in the book, the first 10 chapters, I alternate between a biography of Viola MacMillan and the beginnings of the scandal. And then the second half of the book is the scandal takes over.
Yeah.
So she's she's a remarkable woman who, you know what, 3 or 4 years ago, I'd never heard of her. And as soon as I read about it, I said, "Oh, there's a book here." So it's sort of unfortunate that she's been forgotten because
Yeah.
she's she's a really remarkable woman.
That was my first reaction when I first was put into contact with or made aware of this book, right, through the publicist and through advertising that I saw for it. Was, I'm someone who does study Canadian literature and history, and as you said, never even heard of Viola MacMillan or even the scandal in general, right? So I think just on that regard, it makes it that much more interesting of a read, and very much something that is worth exploring. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so, as you mentioned, the first half is very much focused on MacMillan herself. So, because she's so central to this narrative that you tell, can you actually give listeners a bit of an indication about how she entered into the mining world in the first place? Because, especially at the time, it would have been rather unusual for a woman to be in that position. And that's something that you actually explore in the book a little bit, which we'll get to later. But can you give us a little bit of background as to how MacMillan entered into the mining world in the way that she did?
Yeah, absolutely. So she grew up the 13th of 15 kids, dirt poor, on a farm in Ontario, and had to drop out of school after at age 6 after grade at age 12 after grade 6, and but dreamed of becoming a stenographer, which he thought was the most glamorous job in the world. uh, she later then did her high school equivalency and went to business school to become a stenographer, although she had to drop out. And she eventually ended up in Windsor, and works. various jobs, and then goes to business school, becomes a stenographer at a law firm in Windsor. And she meets a guy named George MacMillan, whose uncle has some claims that he needs to do some work on. So she goes up with him and tries prospecting and loves it. So for several years in the 1920s, she spends a little time every summer doing some prospecting. Then in the Depression, by the early 30s, she had left her job at the law firm and was doing real estate and selling Christmas cards. And she decides, okay, I mean, the real estate market obviously was terrible in the Depression.
Mhm.
She said, okay, I'm going north to be a prospector to George. She says, you know, like I'm going, he just got a new job, but he said, I'm going north. You can come if you want, but if you don't, I'll be fine. The two of them go up and they have no money. They're prospecting. They would stake a claim and sell it and, be able to eat a bit. Um, but after a few years, she discovers that she's actually really good at the business side of mining. And her experience in the law office, exposed her to some of that stuff. So she opens an office in Timmins, and then after a few years, opens an office in Toronto.
Mhm.
And so she continues to prospect, but she also has this business on the financial side. And I should say, so there's two sides of the mining business. One is prospecting, and the other is developing or promoting or whatever term you. She didn't like to be called a promoter. She liked to be called a mine developer, but you
Uh-huh.
know, when we get to the
Technicality.
scandal,
Yeah.
she was clearly a promoter. And so she was really successful. Like she had her first producing mine in the 1940s. In the 1950s, she had several. And she also, in 1941, her husband became the president of the Ontario Prospectors Association. And I guess by then it was called the Ontario Prospectors and Developers Association. And she did all the work as she was this, elected secretary, and she did all the work. And he was getting thank for things he'd never done. She'd sign his name and whatnot. So in 1944, she became the president. Now, this is remarkable. Like this organization was practically a male fraternity,
Yeah.
and she
Yeah.
becomes the president. And some of the guys weren't too keen on this.
Mhm.
Um, but she held the job until the scandal. In the scandal was in 64, and
Mhm.
in beginning of 65, she says, "Okay, I'm stepping down. I'm not going to run again because of course, her
It's
reputation is
yeah,
better."
exactly.
Uh, but we could talk more about what she did in the PDA. But uh, so she was a real dynamite force in mining in Canada, and she was a woman. And both in the prospecting side and the financial side, there weren't very many, well, particularly when she started, but even later, it's a
Yeah.
very male-dominated industry.
Actually, kind of that segues nicely into the next question I have, right, which is about the gender dynamics in the mining industry that you you explore in the book. And there was a passage, and if you don't mind, I'll read a brief quote here from the book that I thought was quite revelatory of how she kind of navigated this field, this boys' club, as you call it, in the book. And there's a passage, this is on the bottom of page 80, where you say, um, upon hearing the brusque assessment of her husband, she looked Segsworth in the eye. She wasn't intimidated by him. George will make a very good president, she declared. I'll see that he does. Right? And there was room for most of the others in the room. A few weeks later at the annual meeting, George won the presidency by acclamation. Viola was unopposed for the secretary-treasurer position, although she and Segsworth continued to have a difficult relationship. She kept her vow to him by taking care of most of her husband's responsibilities. Um, and I guess could you elaborate a little bit on how she navigated this kind of male-dominated field, right? Especially at the time and still in many ways today, right? What kind of challenges did she face? How did she overcome them? That kind of thing.
Well, I think probably she was successful because, like most women who have to do it in male-dominant fields, she was smarter, tougher, and worked harder.
Yeah, exactly.
She wasn't intimidated by men.
Yeah.
And in fact, by the end of her time as the president, I think she intimidated more men than not. And she was just really good at her job. Like she took this organization, which was a handful of prospectors who were,
Mhm.
basically people who worked by themselves or maybe in pairs.
Yeah.
And she turned it into a national organization that had real lobbying clout
Hmm.
and did education for prospectors and others in the mining field, and built up this annual convention every March. 4,000 people meet in Toronto. It's not as wild as it used to be. Now it's a lot more suits, but
Hmm. Yeah.
in the early days, it was, the one chance for a year for all the prospectors to come out of the bush and, and party it up at well, it used to be the Royal York for many years, but
Sure.
at the
Yeah. Yeah.
Royal York in Toronto.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's as we were saying at the beginning, it's sort of amazing that she's been forgotten because what
Hmm.
she did was amazing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, One of the things that you also mentioned in an earlier response, right, was the fact that the scandal happened in 1964. And before we talk about it in depth, I do want to highlight something else that happened in 1964 that I think gives a more complete picture of MacMillan as a person, and how she navigated this world, which is the fact that she appeared on a television show at the time called To Tell the Truth, on the same year, or in the same year actually, as the scandal happened. Um, and I'm wondering if you could discuss a little bit how moments like this, right, where she had to put on some kind of public persona, of course, um, mirrored or tell us something about how she actually, what the reality of her business dealings were, right? Is there some kind of parallel that we can make between persona versus reality, or anything like that?
Okay, so she was a minor celebrity in
Yeah.
Canada.
Mhm.
She was this glamorous looking woman in this, in mid-century Canada. Not that many women worked outside the home, and I can't remember the stat, but I have a stat in the book, like something like only 3,000 Canadian women made more than $10,000, which would be equivalent of 100,000 today. So the women who did work out of the home were not not in good jobs. So she was really successful, and the Toronto Star had a supplement called the Star Weekly, and every few years they would do a profile of her. And from the 1930s, um, there were newspapers were and magazines were doing stories about her. So the press loved her. She was a good quote. Now, the mining reporters found her incredibly frustrating because she would never answer their questions. But if it was a general reporter, she was great. She would, come into my house, come into my, and just put on a little show for them,
Yeah.
go on television, go on radio. And she used that to promote herself. She would say she was promoting the Prospectors and Developers Association, um, but there was always sort of a fuzzy line
Yeah.
between what was good for her and what was good for the association.
For sure.
I mean, she really was an evangelist for the mining industry and particularly for prospecting.
Yeah.
So it wasn't false, but she was also benefiting when she promoted this stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, but she, you know, probably in those days, people used the media like today, lots of people use the media that way.
Yeah.
But I think it was less common in those days.
I was just about to say you can definitely see parallels with he's dead now, of course, but the way that Steve Jobs became a stand-in for Apple, for example,
Yeah.
or to take perhaps a more controversial example, right? The way Elon Musk becomes a stand-in for Tesla, right? That kind of stuff is, as you're saying, chock full in especially the tech industry now, which I guess is the more modern version of the mining industry, if you really want to make that
Yeah.
parallel. But yeah, I agree. It's really fascinating that she did that at a time when it wasn't that popular to do so. Yeah. Um, so after all of this preamble, right? I guess leading up to the scandal, which is obviously a central turning point for MacMillan's life. Um, can you actually tell listeners a little bit about what the Windfall scandal was, right? What happened and why it was such a pivotal moment in Canadian mining and financial history?
Okay, so I'm gonna
There can be a lot of preface to this, of course.
yeah, well, I'm gonna start a big American mining company called Texas Gulf Sulfur discovered um, a copper, zinc, and silver deposit really close to Timmins. Now, Timmins had been a gold area uh, since 1909. There was the Porcupine Gold Rush, and there was still uh, gold mines in Timmins, although they were coming to the end of their life, and the town looked like it was not going to be doing too well. And this big American company finds this massive deposit, and they kept it quiet and locked up all the land around their discovery. But the rumors were starting to get out. And then eventually in April, they announced that they had it, which started a big staking rush, and which didn't amount to much because, as I say, all the good land was taken.
Yeah.
But there were four claims. I should also say that that discovery
Hmm.
led to a staking rush, but also led to a big boom in mining stocks. Um,
We can talk about that a little bit later. I have a question on
okay.
the Toronto Stock
And
Exchange.
so Viola MacMillan was able to, because of a staking error, there were four claims that Texas Gulf wanted that didn't get. They didn't get it, and three prospectors who had heard rumors about a big find and had got some claims around that area. They own these four that Texas Gulf had wanted. So she went up to Timmins. She knew these prospectors, and she bought them. She paid a ton of money. She bought them personally and then sold them to Windfall, which is a company that she and her husband controlled. Her husband was the president. She owned the most shares. Um, so then, they do the preparatory work. They do, some geology. They do some geophysics, and then they start drilling um, on July 1st. Now she's on, to tell the truth, a couple of weeks earlier, um, which just, raises the profile of this. And after a few days, her husband George stops the drill
Mhm.
because he didn't have a core shack. Now, core shack, it's a little building on a drill site where a mining company can store the core. That's the stuff that the drill pulls out of the ground. It's a cylinder of rock that goes down hundreds of feet, and it goes into 5-foot boxes, and you store it in a core shack, and then lock it and it's safe. He didn't have a core shack, and he wanted to have one, so he paused the drill. Well, this got everyone, like everyone's in sort of a heightened sense of sensitivity to this. Like
Yeah, yeah,
every
yeah.
one of the things, like all these discoveries. So the cobalt silver boom, which was 1903, and then the Porcupine Gold Rush 1909, and then the Kirkland Lake Gold Rush a few years later. There was always lots of discoveries, and so everyone was assuming there will be more.
Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't know who was going to get them. But she had these four claims that Texas Gulf had wanted. So it seemed like, okay, this is a good bet. And oh, they stopped the drill.
Mhm.
And meanwhile, all these helicopters are going over the drill because other people are like, oh, what's going on? What's going on?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so Mo- that was on the weekend that he stopped the drill. On Monday, the stock had been trading at like 55, 60 cents on it closed at a Friday on Friday. Monday morning it opens at $1. And then over the next 3 weeks, it just goes up and up. It hits $5.70. And meanwhile, the Toronto Stock Exchange is saying, okay, you got to release some results. And MacMillan and her husband are just staying silent. And rumor and human greed and all the normal things push the stock into a frenzy. And all these people are. One thing I should say is back then there were no lotteries, there were no casinos, there was no sports gambling. If you had an itch to gamble,
Hmm.
you had the racetrack or you had the penny stocks on the stock market. And so lots of people, that's what they did, like, oh, put, some money in there. And I don't know, do you want me to go into what happened when it
Please, I mean, it's your show at the end of the day. Go for it. Yeah.
okay, so eventually they have to, like the Toronto Stock says, okay, you have to. They had kind of delayed it by saying, "Oh, well, we haven't finished the hole yet.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
we,
Yeah.
we won't do any assays until we finish the hole." And then they eventually finish the hole. They do the assays, and then they release the results. They got nothing. So of course the stock plummets. So many people lost money. So Viola MacMillan made about $1.5 million, which in today's dollars is about 10 million.
Yeah.
Other investors, many of them small investors, lost 2.5 million. So,
Ouch.
um, so uh, the Ontario government appoints a royal commission and to look into this, and it was really supposed to look at the whole business of the stock the stock market and mining stocks and all that kind of stuff. But it really became about Windfall. Um, and
Yeah.
that was the scandal. We could talk about the repercussions if you want.
No, for sure. And you gave just in that story, you gave a lot of avenues for further questions that I wasn't sure where I would put them. So I think I'll start with this one where we had already talked about how MacMillan was very adept at talking to journalists, right? Or at least the general media. Um, do you think that journalists at the end of the day or the media in general were helpful in the sense um, of creating the landscape wherein the scandal could take place, right? Or allowing her to actually um, you know almost get away with it, quote unquote, right? Is there a complicity with the way that media portrayed MacMillan, or is there something else going on here? Is it nothing at all?
The media, and by that, at that time, it was particularly the newspapers. I mean,
Yes, of
it
course,
wasn't 24-hour news on TV or anything like that.
yeah,
So we're talking primarily newspapers.
of course.
Um, well, first of all, they had built her up for decades
Hmm.
as this very respectable, honest, ethical uh, woman. And so that, people say, oh, well, she has something.
There's a
Um,
trust
and
there.
then, and then there's the rumors. And of course, all these reporters tried to talk to her. And she had a tendency to say cryptic things and tell different people different things. um, but what they ended up doing, because they couldn't get anything specific, they started printing rumors. And they would say rumored, but the more they repeated these rumors, the more they seemed to sound like fact.
Hmm. Yeah,
And the Northern Miner, which was still is the Bible of the mining industry, did a whole issue, or not a whole issue, but it did an issue with several stories and an editorial that basically congratulated them. Like they just at a certain point they just assumed that they had something. And with a few cautionary, like, well, we don't know for sure the results, but it seems that they've got something. And congrats to the vivacious Viola MacMillan and her steady husband George, that kind of stuff. And uh, so yes, like
Yeah.
if you are the average dude sitting at home reading the newspaper, wanting to invest, I'm going to make some money on the stock market. And you're reading this, you go like, okay, this is a sure thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, actually, that leads into the next question that I had right on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So you mentioned that obviously it played a role in the scandal, right? People invested in Windfall with the expectation of further their dividends, as you do in the stock exchange. Um, so specifically shifting to the repercussions of this scandal, right? Is there a way that the Windfall scandal shaped how Canadian security regulations or the stock market operates, right? Um, did it have any kind of impact on something like the Toronto Stock Exchange, which you raise in your story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
So the Royal Commission, in the end, came up with a lot of recommendations for the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Ontario Securities Commission. Um, now, the Toronto Stock Exchange was very much a boys' club, and the Royal Commissioner uh, called it they operated it like a private gaming club, and they regulated themselves basically. And the OSC
Yeah.
was sort of involved, but they they had different spheres and a little bit of overlap.
Hmm.
And the OSC couldn't really tell the TSC what to do. Um, so what Arthur Kelly, the Royal Commissioner, said was, okay, you've got to tighten up all these areas.
Yeah.
And one of the things was about penny stocks, the speculative mining stocks in particular. Um, and so what happened was they all moved to Vancouver. Where in the 1980s, the Vancouver Stock Exchange became known as the scam capital of the world. So, um, now the Toronto Stock Exchange did set up the Toronto Stock Exchange now goes by TSX. It
Yeah.
was,
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
but they set up the venture exchange for smaller companies. Um, there were all sorts of, sort of more training, more oversight, those kind of things. But the main thing was to rein in the Wild West approach to these small mining stocks. And they had this financing model, these underwriting agreements that they didn't need anything basically. They didn't need any results or anything. You just put a stock out and say, "Oh, we've got this property," and then you promote it. And the deals were all set up in a way that the promoters made money. The promoter made more money than the company. And so there were a lot of problems with it back then. And I think it was really important that these changes took place because even today, the Toronto Stock Exchange is the eighth largest in the world, but it's got the most mining and oil and gas stocks of any exchange in the world. And if it had continued down the road of being scandal ridden,
Sure.
then I don't think it would be as important today as it is.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about this because you'd think that these kinds of regulations would have happened earlier, right? Like the people had gone through something relatively similar not that long ago as far as like human history was concerned, right? During that was one of the causes of the Great Depression, right? Which would have been in most people's living memory at that point. Um, so it's kind of fascinating that it took until the 1960s before these types of regulations would have been implemented, which I think, or I guess, reveals a lot about people's priorities where the stock market is concerned. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but I just find it fascinating that it would take that long before it would happen.
Well, things during the Depression, things were tightened up. Um, so in the early part of the century, the Toronto Stock Exchange didn't have that many small mining companies on it.
Right.
They were all on something called the Standard Stock and Mining Exchange. And then after the Great Depression started, um, the Ontario government made the two join together,
Mhm.
merge into the Toronto Stock Exchange. And that's when the Toronto Stock Exchange became bigger than the Montreal Stock Exchange. Montreal was still the more important financial center at the time. But because of all these small mining companies on this merged TSE, it became bigger, and
Mhm.
that was sort of the beginning of. And of course, we won't get into all the political stuff in Quebec,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
that was the beginning of the movement of
Away from
Montreal, the
Montreal.
financial center of Canada, to Toronto taking over. Um, but like even in the 60s, Bay Street was sort of a small community, and they ran like General Graham, who was the president of the stock exchange in 64. He was the first president the exchange had
Mm.
that wasn't the president of one of the companies. So to use an analogy of the National Hockey League, it's like the owner of the Habs is the president of the league instead
Right.
of betting, and out, I won't say an outside, but someone who's not connected to any of the teams.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, and it basically, there was the government said, look, you guys police yourself, just don't do anything that's going to embarrass us. And then, of course, the Windfall scandal was very embarrassing.
Sure.
Um, and that's why there were changes.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the questions that I had planned, but it also reveals a lot about the mining culture and what you refer to in this interview, right, as the boom towns, right? Which, at least speaking for myself, we tend to associate with things like the Yukon Gold Rush or what actually what happened in British Columbia, right? A gold rush also created what we now understand as like modern day British Columbia. And so we tend to relegate these moments to the 19th century, late 19th century, and then kind of fizzled out, right? Or at least in the popular imagination of the boom towns. Um, and so I guess my question would be, does this story, or what does the story reveal about mining boomtown culture, right, as it continued into the 20th century? Is it the same as the boomtown culture that we saw in Dawson City, right? Or is it something new and that was very different, right, for the 20th century?
Well, the thing about Windfall is it took place in Timmins, which
Mm,
was already a good sized city.
yeah.
The Klondike Gold Rush, or the three big ones early in that century in Ontario, the Cobalt Silver Boom, the Porcupine Gold Rush, and the Kirkland Lake Gold Rush, they basically all created towns. So you had, um, they start off as like tent communities because there's nothing there. And then in the same way Dawson starts off as a tent community and builds up into a town. Um, but like even in the 50s, in northern Saskatchewan, Uranium City, it's a tent city. And because of all the uranium mines
Mm,
found there in the 50s. So Windfall was a little different, but also similar. Like, okay, yes, there's this town called Timmins, which at the time had about 30,000 people, though it was sort of dropping a bit.
mhm,
And they knew mining. They've been doing it for decades. But all of a sudden, there's money, and all the hotels are filled, and the bars and restaurants are filled, and there's a boomtown energy and boomtown money. And that's that's the history of mining in this country.
Yeah, 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 for sure. It's just fascinating to me that you don't perceive that as much, or at least again in the history books that you would commonly see. It's just not something that you would associate, especially with the late 20th century. So I just find that fascinating to see it come up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, the big difference is
Yeah,
whether there's a town there or not. But
yeah,
look at the Northwest Territories and their diamond boom.
that's true.
Now, because of technology and whatnot, you know, companies could set up in Yellowknife and then fly people to their mines and stuff rather than creating new towns where the mines were.
Media
Um,
landscape is different enough that you don't necessarily get these rushes based entirely on people's imagination, right?
well, you know, one of the things is in the earlier days, it was mostly individual prospectors.
Mhm.
And so somebody would find something, and then all these prospectors would move in and, you know, stake some claims and hope that they had found a mine.
Yeah,
And now it's big companies,
that's true.
right? You know, and even if they send a couple of prospectors in, it's the big company owns it.
Mhm.
And so, you know, the big company is going to hire people and, you know, they're going to need locals to provide services, but there
Mhm.
isn't a rush of people thinking they can get rich too.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so just moving on to another question, just because I'm seeing the time go, and I want to make sure that we get as complete of an interview as possible. But we've alluded to here and there um, to the impact that the scandal has, right, on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Um, but what kind of impact would you say that MacMillan, or maybe even the scandal, right, has had beyond these types of regulations, right? One of the things that you raise in the book is the fact that the PDA grew significantly, right, under her leadership. But what kind of impact, more generally, can we say that this whole moment had on Canadian history and the mining history specifically?
I I don't I think in a way it was a blip. You
Okay,
know, it was
yeah,
oh, and there's another scandal, and then we carry on. You know, so
it's
she resigned.
worthwhile. Yeah, it's in and of itself, it's an interesting fact. Yeah.
She resigns as the head of then called PDA, now called
Mm,
Prospectors Development Association of Canada, so
yeah.
PDAC. But she resigns in January of 65, and they cancel their annual convention because she ran it. She she was so much in control of that organization.
Mhm.
But the next year, the convention is back, and you know, just last month, 4,000 people were here in Toronto at the convention center for the annual PDAC convention.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, I mean, it probably became harder to raise money after that scandal, and obviously there
Yeah.
were changes at the TSE and whatnot. But I think the fact that she's basically forgotten suggests that you know that people don't know her, people don't know the scandal. So I don't think it's had that kind of long term
Yeah. If anything,
impact.
it says something about people's faith in the market, right? I guess like capital M market to kind of move on without individuals' input or something like that, right? Which it technically has, right? As you're saying.
Well,
Um,
you know, I think what happens is people get skittish about investing for a few years,
yeah,
and then it's the next boom, you know, it's the dot-com boom, it's the
yeah.
crypto boom, it's like, you know, whatever. And once you get burned, you like, oh, I'm not gonna do that. And then all of a sudden you get things change.
It's the boom and bust cycle all over again. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I think the that's human nature is to believe that you're gonna strike it
So
rich.
yeah, things are going to get different, are going to be different next time. Interesting.
Or at
Um,
least you're going to get in and get out
yeah,
quick enough.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Others are going to be fooled, but not me, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I want to finish off with a few questions that return back to Viola herself. So one of the things that I thought was particularly um, good and insightful about the book was how you paint MacMillan with, pretty significant nuance, right? You never really condemn her for her actions, um, but you don't absolve her either, right? And I'm curious, just from a writing standpoint or even from a research standpoint, what it's like to try to balance these things, right? Because she was a convicted criminal, but you still want to create a fully fleshed, I guess, character portrait, right, of this person who was much more than just a convicted criminal. So, what was that like actually trying to balance that?
Well, should we say what she was convicted of? And
Go for
if
it. If you, again, it depends how much you want to say about your book. So, I'm I'll follow your lead here.
Okay, well, so the Royal Commission basically accuses her and George of fraud. Um, and so then they get charged. They eventually get off on that. But the Royal Commission also, for the first time, used IBM computers to analyze trading on the stock exchange. And they discovered that she had been trading in another one of her companies called Consolidated Golden Arrow. And she um, it was called wash trading. It basically she was trading with herself. She had one of her companies sell stock in Golden Arrow to another one of her companies
Yeah.
at the same time as a Windfall scandal. So she was charged with wash trading, and she got 9 months. She got out after 7 weeks, and that was another scandal for the Ontario government because everybody's saying, "Well, there's one law for the rich and another for the poor," and but then she had a rehabilitation, which we could talk about. But just in terms of your question about how I portrayed her, I mean, I guess the easy answer is that I'm conflicted, although that's maybe a bit too simplistic. Let me put it this way. I don't see her as a villain. I see her as a flawed hero, which is
Interesting.
the best kind of hero. Like
Yeah.
to me, the fact that she isn't perfect or she isn't like completely evil is what's interesting about her. That here was this really quite remarkable woman who was successful and influential and rich, and she had it all.
Mhm.
And then at age 61, she is involved in this scandal that ruins her reputation. Um, and then, so for me, it was figuring, well, why? Why did she do it? And at the end of the book, I try to suggest that it was more than money, I think,
Yeah.
because he had plenty. Although that doesn't stop people.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
but I think there's more to it than that. And that part I'll leave for the reader. But and also it wasn't so much a conscious decision to portray her with what you call nuance. I mean,
Mhm.
I was just following the facts, you
Yeah,
know. I mean, yes, of course I'm picking facts and
of course.
I could have portrayed her in a more positive light or a more negative light. I will say that people who've read it, most of them say that they end up liking her.
Yeah, I had that impression too by the end. It kind of ends on a note, like which again we'll leave to the readers, but it ends on a note that I was like, huh, I I genuinely wasn't expecting to to appreciate her as a person that much. Yeah, I think that's a really good. I think that says more about your writing than anything else, right? Or well, it says something about her as well. But yeah, I appreciated that about the book. Um, so I'm bringing this up because you mentioned it in the previous question, but um, she went through a kind of rehabilitation, right? She served jail time and was later pardoned. Um, so how do you kind of see this rehabilitation, right? Is it a consciousness that we fully reckoned with her legacy, or is it an act of rewriting the scandal, right? How do you perceive this kind of rehabilitation that she went through?
Okay, so just to clarify,
Oh,
to
yes, of
say
course.
someone is pardoned doesn't mean that they're innocent.
That's
It
true.
means that their record is wiped clean.
That
Now,
is true.
she talked about it as if it meant she was innocent, but that's not
Mhm. Yeah.
correct. Um, but yes, she did go, the mining industry, you know, took her back. The
Mhm.
PDAC uh, has an award named after her. She got in the Mining Hall of Fame. Um, she got another honor. I'm going to leave that, but she
Mhm.
got a national honor. You can probably guess. Um, but at the same time, no one knows her. And I mean, I'm a lot older than you, but I had never heard of her, and I'd worked in the mining industry for a bit. Um, so did it really matter? You know, I mean,
Yeah.
uh, I don't know. I said to someone that, well, maybe the fact that this scandal is why we've forgotten her. And but then people say, well, no.
Yeah.
It's just like it was a long time ago, and there's so much other stuff. But
Yeah.
I think she's the kind of woman that, like, she's a flawed hero, but she's a Canadian hero.
Yeah. I like that. I like that to end on. Um, I do always ask one last question though, as I don't know if you listen to any of my other interviews, but I always ask one last question, which is, what did I not ask in this interview? And what's the answer to that question?
Well, I think you've covered a lot of ground, but in the questions you sent me, your last question was about problems researching it. And that's not an essential question, but I kind of wanted to answer it.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Uh, so my last book, which was called Klondikers, which is about Dawson City's 1905 Stanley Cup Challenge. Um, I had never done that kind of book I'd always done books where I went out and interviewed people.
Mhm.
And I did that book, in archives because this happened in 1904 and everybody was long dead. And I was naive. I thought, oh, well, there'll be diaries and letters from the players and whatnot. And then I went into the archives and there was none of that. So it was really difficult to get all the information. And at one point I said, oh, I said to my editor, I said, oh, well, I have too much to quit, but not enough to go ahead.
Yeah.
And then I kept reading, and then I read about, I won't talk too much about the book, but I read about how they started doing play-by-play of hockey games in 1896. And as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, okay, I know how to do this book. When I finished it, it was like, well, I really like doing archival research, but I miss talking to people. And so I was looking for an idea. And then Windfall came along, or I didn't come along. I read about it. I said, oh, this would be perfect. It was, like all the main characters are dead, unfortunately. But there was so much information. As we talked about there, she did a million interviews and there are a million profiles written about it. She has 66 boxes of papers and stuff in an archives in Gatineau, Quebec. And I had the transcripts from the Royal Commission and the Ontario Securities Commission inquiry of like 6,000 pages or something of transcripts. So I have all these people who are dead. I have all of them under oath testifying. And so, in a way, it was really easy to write this book because there was so much information, um, as opposed to my last one where I didn't have enough. I'm trying to do the Robert Caro thing of turn every page.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, you have to say, okay,
Sure.
I've got it. But the transcripts were really helpful. And people saying it's like, wow, it's amazing. You have like what happened hour by hour during the peak of the scandal. And that's because I have what people said to the Royal Commission. They said, oh, well, I said this and she said that, and I thought she meant that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so that was what the writing process was like. But I had few moments of frustration compared to my other books.
Which is good. It's always nice to have a frustration-free process.
Well, it's good for me. I hope it's good for the reader as well.
Yeah. Um, which I if in case it wasn't clear to listeners, I do recommend this book. It's really good. And as always, there will be a link to where you can get it. It's already released at this point. It was released in February, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, uh, I'll include a link to where people can buy it. And be one of the last things I always mention, is there anywhere where people can get into contact with you if they have further questions or inquiries, or is it all through the publicist?
No, I just go on my website and there's a contact yeah, link or email. I can't remember what
Yeah,
yeah.
whatever. It's
You can
all over there. But thank you again for your time, Tim. It was really great talking to you, and I highly recommend Windfall, the Viola MacMillan story. Yeah, it's not that's not the actual like subtitle, but Windfall is great, is my point. Yeah.
Thank you. It's great talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely.